So as Ty said, my name is Justin Milcarek. I am the Hybrid Rye Sales Manager for KWS. I first off want to thank everyone from Albert Lee for throwing this program together. It's been a great program so far, and thank you for having me be a part of it. So I will start with a few basics about Hybrid Rye and KWS. I'll start with KWS, our company, just give a little background. So KWS is a family-owned plant breeding company in Germany. They were founded in 1856, and to this day, we still have a family member on the board. So it is very much a family-ran organization. We are the largest, between the fourth and fifth largest breeding company in the world. It goes back and forth a little bit, but something that we have a little different than the other big ones that we all know of in the United States is we only sell seed genetics. We don't sell chemicals or anything. We just strictly sell seed. So we're strictly a seed and research company. They have been breeding hybrid rye in Germany since the 1980s. And the reason for that is in Europe, there's a big push for biofuel. So they're actually chopping the plant and burning it to create fuel. Where in the United States, we can chop the plant and feed it to cattle or swine or other livestock. Something that they saw that they weren't taking advantage of. So in 2014, they launched Hybrid Rye in Canada. And then 2 years later, we launched Hybrid Rye in the United States in 2016. The top takeaway from my presentation is that this is a new crop. Rye has been around for a very long time, open pollinated rye, but we need to treat this differently. So if you are interested or are growing this currently, you definitely have to treat it different than you have treated rye in the past. And I will go through a lot of that in this presentation. So why hybrid rye? Hybrids, corn was hybridized a long time ago. And the thing that comes with hybrid, when you hybridize something is hybrid vigor. You're going to get higher yields, better plant growth, better root growth. And you can see this here in the image and tillering capacity. So hybrid rye has a very good tillering capacity. You can see that there in the photo. It's got a good root system. It does pretty good in drought resistance, very good with weed control. It has an allopathic effect. It exudes a toxin into the soil while the plant is growing, and it keeps weed pressure down. It uses 20% less water than wheat, and it has a very high disease resistance. So when comparing it to wheat uses a lot of its leaf tissue for the photosynthesis process, where rye uses its stem. So most of the stem is used and the leaves are not used. So the leaves aren't attacked as much with diseases. Therefore, you can use less fungicide. I hit on this a little bit. This is just an image that shows you the differences of the different crops here that are planted in the fall and the weed suppression that they have. The hybrid rye is there at the bottom right. And rye in general exudes that toxin. And I was actually walking a field yesterday that's ready for harvest. So the plant's completely dead. And as soon as that plant stops, starts to die, it stops to exude that toxin. And the field I was walking yesterday, you could already see weeds coming up through because of those toxins that stop. So when they're working, they really do work. And it's a good natural way to suppress weeds. All the hybrid rye is currently bred in Europe, in Germany mostly, and none of the current, we don't have any GMO hybrid rye. We do, however, have a naturally selected gene that the breeders selected for, and we call it Pollen Plus. And this is our first defense against ergot. So ergot is a fungus. It's going to be more prevalent in areas when there's a lot more moisture in the ground and soil. So the dry, arid climates may not be as big as an issue, but in the upper Midwest, except this year, but on most normal years, we have a little more rain than most areas. So ergot can be an issue. And ergot is a fungus. It creates a spore. If the spore of the ergot beats the pollen spore from the plant to the anther, it'll create the ergot spore. So one defense mechanism that the breeders wanted to do, because they understood the problem that this can cause, is they found a naturally selected gene that creates a ton of pollen. So the more pollen in the air, the less chance that those ergot spores can land. Now, it's not saying that we'll never get ergot. You can definitely still get ergot, but this is just the first line of defense against this, and it creates a ton of pollen. There is a less risk of fusarium. A big plus is lower crop inputs. So I'm going to talk about seeding rate in a little bit, but there's less seed used, less fertilizer, less chemical, and there's little to no drying requirements. There's also good crop rotation benefits. It can, anytime a small grain is planted, there's been some research that shows small, but you yield gains if you do a crop of a corn and soybean rotation. So if you throw a small grain, winter small grain into that, the next crop will see a small yield increase from that crop being there before. Here's a very good illustration of the Pollen Plus. So currently in the United States, KWS is the only company that is currently selling hybrid rye, and we sell through a dealer network such as Albert Lee. But there's no other current competitors out there actively selling hybrid rye. We do know there's a few European companies we're starting to see them in some trials, but they're not commercialized yet. Here in the United States. But one of those varieties is there on the left, and then our KWS variety is on the right. And you can see that Pollen Plus gene, how it works and creates a ton of pollen at the bottom of that sac there. So that's just a good comparison of another hybrid rye that could be coming to the United States, but just shows what that Pollen Plus gene can really do. Here's just another photo of the field. And another thing that differentiates hybrid rye from open pollinated rye is the pollination window. Open pollinated rye can pollinate from 3 to 4 to almost a week. It can take up to 7 days to pollinate, where our hybrid rye fields, they pollinate themselves in a 24 to 48 hour window. So also by shortening that window, we're shortening the risk for ergot. So a hybrid rye unit, our units are a little different than most of the other small grains. A lot of times you'll plant by the weight or the bushel, but our units are actually 1 million viable seeds. We chose to do this because we wanted the farmer to get exactly what they were paying for. So with that being said, if you have a lot of seed that germinated at 90%, that unit would be 1.1 million seeds. You're gonna get 1.1 million seeds to account for that 10% that didn't germ. The tricky thing about that is our lots and units, the weights can tend to vary from lot to lot. Planting recommendations then can vary, but we do have things that will help minimize those complications. And all of that information, you're looking at a seed tag there on the right, and all of the weight and information is there on the seed tag. Something else that's on the seed tag, if you look in the middle, you'll notice the QR code. If you scan that QR code, it will take you to the seeding rate calculator. I believe I have that on the next screen, so I'll talk about that a little bit more. The seeding rate for hybrid rye, we recommend 0.8 units to the acre. So if you remember, a unit is 1 million viable seeds. Our seeding rate is 800,000 seeds per acre. Seeding depth is extremely important. If you go a little bit higher, a little bit lower, you will see some yield drag. And then I talked earlier about the seed rate calculator. So if you were to scan the QR code, if you buy the seed and you get the tag, scan that QR code and it'll bring you to this seed rate calculator. Using the information from the tag, you will plug it into this seed rate calculator, and it will show you exactly how many seeds per foot you need to plant. And then it'll also show you in the spring how many plants you should see for an appropriate yield. So it's just a very good tool that helps with the planting rate recommendations. And I cannot stress enough, especially this year or years like we had last year, more droughty conditions. If you're planting something at 1/3 less of the rate as the open pollinated rye, we got a lot of calls about stands this year because of the drought conditions. And if you have one seed that doesn't germinate and it's next to a field that was planted at 3 times the rate, that one seed that doesn't germinate actually accounts for 3 seeds of the other field. So this year we had some stand issues because of drought and some fields that were terminated. A couple farmers actually were really close to terminating it, but they did not. They decided just to let it go, and they ended up being quite happy with the results. So even though the stand at the beginning of the year looked really bad, the hybrid rye really tillers, and that's why we recommend the lower seeding rate because of the tillering capacity. I have seen plants tiller anywhere from 8 to 16 tillers from one plant, and each one of those tillers will create a head, a seed head. So that's where we'll get the better yield in the open pollinated rye, is just coming from that tillering capacity. So once again, on seed depth, very, very important. Again, you can see there on the left, if it's planted on the surface, it needs really good seed to soil contact. That 8.8 inch is where we want to be. If you go deeper at 1.7 inch, you can see the photo there on the right, that it just doesn't come up properly. And then at the bottom, it shows you the different depths in the yield drag that occurs. And another thing that we see with seeding, a lot of times we'll get calls where the field looks really good in the fall, it's green, every plant came up great, and then the winter comes and people think it's winter kill because in the spring the stand is very much reduced. Most of the time that is due to if there's a lot of other plant residue in that field and they're just planting through that, they're not getting that good seed to soil contact, but that seed will germinate in the fall in the residue. It'll grow, it'll look green, but then when winter comes, that seed has no chance to survive. So that plant dies, and that's why they see less stand in the spring. So the planting is super important. We recommend if you have an air seeder, we'll recommend guys if they have a big corn air seeder to just, instead of buying another planter or using an old drill or broadcasting it, we do not want anyone to broadcast. This seed needs to be spaced properly. We'll tell these guys to take their corn planter, buy the correct plates for small grains, change the plates out, and then they can plant twice throughout the field, offset with the row spacing that they like, and just offset it and go across the field twice. We've had people be very successful doing that. So it works, but it just depends on what works best for your situation. Planting date is going to vary depending on where you're at in the United States. But for the most part, just kind of follow the wheat planting. And what this graph is showing you is if you plant early or plant late, what that yield will end up doing. So there's less yield drag if you plant a little bit early, and then there's more yield drag if you plant later. If for some reason you're in a situation where you have to plant later, we do recommend bumping up that seeding rate, maybe 100,000 to 200,000 seeds, which would get you to 1 million seeds per acre, but we do not recommend going over 1 million seeds an acre. And the goal in the fall is to get good root and tiller development. If we can get 3 or 4 tillers going through winter, that's a really good start for that next spring. Now, with that being said, I've seen a lot of fields this spring, and depending on the weather situations, but this year, some of the fields that didn't come up at all actually did a little bit better because they were protected through the winter without being water, and then that snow melt created enough water for those seeds to germinate, and they had a decent field. But that's not normal circumstances. In normal circumstances, we would like to see some tillers going into the fall and overwintering. I've talked a little bit about winter kill. So with a lot of our genetics coming from Northern Europe and even Russia, we have not seen any winter kill in the United States. And we have farmers all the way up in Minnesota on the border of Minnesota and Canada. So they're not seeing any winter kill. Now, our colleagues in Canada, the more north you go in Canada, they have seen some winter kill, but we just have not seen that here in the United States. So we do have a really good cold tolerant hybrid rye for the United States. And keys to successful planting, and I really can't harp on this enough. You can see from these pictures that stand isn't the best stand because of the crop residue. And that's going to affect their yield. That issue there will be with them through the whole growing season, and in hindsight will definitely negatively affect the field. So if you can get that good seed to soil contact, good row spacing, and that seed planted exactly where we want it, you're gonna have a really good experience, hopefully, with hybrid rye if the weather cooperates. So fertility factors that will impact that for hybrid rye, just like any other crop, do some soil testing, figure out where your deficiencies are. Don't forget to apply nitrogen credits if you have them from your organic matter, soybeans, forages, cover crops, or manure. And then look at your soil type and conditions. It does not do very well in heavy soils, and it does not like wet feet. So if it's planted in in very high moisture soil, it's probably not going to do as well if it was planted in a little bit drier soil. Fertilization and application rates. So total nitrogen, you're going to want to take your expected bushels to the acre times 1.2. So approximately about 100 pounds of nitrogen for if you're looking for forage and grain. And you can see from the graph, if you look at the kind of goldish line, right when tillering starts, that gold line is the nitrogen uptake. And right when tillering starts, that line just kind of spikes up in a few days, and then it kind of evens out and then goes down. So that second round of nitrogen in the spring, it's really important to get out there as early as possible. We'll tell people, if you wake up and there's frost on the morning, but you look at the forecast and that warmth is coming, get out there on that cold morning and spread that fertilizer before that warm up happens, because you want to make sure that nitrogen is available for the plant when it needs it. If you were a couple weeks late, then that plant has already uptook the nitrogen and it's just going to sit there, and that would be a wasted application. So you can do 30 to 60 pounds in the fall, and then you can do the remaining of that in the spring. We also recommend 20 to 25 pounds of phosphorus, sulfur, and then 50 pounds of potassium. Evaluating your stand in the spring is very important, especially in years like this year, where we had a lot of people were trying to determine if they needed to terminate their field and plant something else. It's very important to understand how to evaluate your stand. So you look at your row spacing, and then it tells you the row length. For example, if you were at a 6-inch row width, then you take a measure 24 inches and count the plants in that 24 inches. The goal, 17 plants, is for a great yield. And if you have 10 plants, around 10 plants, and you're going to get adequate yield. And then also in the spring, look for thin areas, and then the thinner areas or the areas that are delayed could potentially be a higher risk for ergot. So just pay attention to those areas, make notes, and then maybe evaluate those as you visit your field throughout the growing season. So harvest tips, we also have a yield calculator on our website. You're going to want to harvest around 15% moisture. This plant does have a ton of straw. So if you need straw, you can cut the plant high and then come back and recut to harvest the straw. You're going to want to avoid broken kernels. The grain is very easy to thresh, and then make sure to calibrate the combine. We do have a production guide on our website that goes into a lot more details than I just did. It's about 14 pages from planting to harvest, on everything you need to do to be successful. So if you are currently growing it, or you would like to grow it in the future, I would highly recommend using that as a tool that you have to learn about and make sure you're doing everything the correct way. And that is all I have. Are there any questions?
All right, thank you, Justin. As we're waiting for some questions to come in, what would you say is the biggest thing for someone that they've been growing open pollinated rye for years? What's the biggest takeaway from transitioning from open pollinated to hybrid rye?
Yep, that is a very good question, Ty. So the very first thing would be, I think where we get a lot of kickback early on is the seeding rate. People that have seeded open pollinated rye, I've heard anywhere from 2 to 3 bushels to the acre. So that can be around, let's just say, 150 pounds. So our recommended seeding rate with our units can average anywhere from 60 to 80 pounds. And then when you're doing 8% of that, you're talking 55, 65 pounds of seed going down when they're used to planting 150 pounds. And right off the bat, a lot of them think, oh, how can we get away with doing that and still yield as much? So that is the biggest thing. And the reason for that, like I said earlier, is the tillering capacity of the hybrid rye. It throws out a lot of tillers, so we need to plant less seed so it has room to tiller. If you were to double the recommended planting rate, and then that it will grow and it'll look great, but you're going to have a higher risk for lodging, and you're going to have less tillering on those plants. So it will negatively affect your yield if you plant too much seed. And then also just planting it. I think a lot of guys are used to planting with whatever, an older drill, or some of them might even broadcast it because they're used to doing it for cover crop. It's really important to use the correct planting equipment, the correct planter, and make sure you're getting it at the correct depth. Definitely take time to calibrate planter. I like to tell people, treat it like you would your corn. Take your time. People calibrate their corn planters every year. Make sure you're doing all those proper steps to ensure the success throughout the season.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna mute you here, Justin. I think I'm getting a little feedback on your end, so my apologies. We did have a question here. Is when do you recommend planting with the no-till drill?
So planting with the no-till drill, that won't affect the planting date. You can still plant it at the same time, but you're going to want to make sure if you're going into trash, try to have some cleaners or something on the road to make sure that seed is getting into the soil and not into the trash. And then if it is going deep into the trash, it won't come up with a real thick trash. So just making sure the rows are clean, even on the no-till drill. So if your no-till drill doesn't have a row cleaner or anything like that, then I would probably recommend trying to use something else or not doing it at all.
All right, thank you. So I got a question about the markets for hybrid rye, which we'll be talking about next. But so we'll just hang tight on there, Darren. Would there be a benefit for using hybrid rye as a cover crop compared to open pollinated, or would you just strictly use it for grain purposes?
Oh, very good question. To start off first, I forgot to mention this. We do have two different types of varieties. We have our forage varieties, and then we have our grain varieties. So pretty self-explanatory there. So cover crop, we know, is a humongous market in the United States. KWS, we don't want our hybrid rye to be known as a cover crop, so we're not promoting it. However, we do know it works. We've had different people maybe at a lower planting rate. I mean, it all has to depend on the farmer. It's their money, correct? So they're spending more for the seed, so they're probably not going to want to terminate it. But we do have people that have been doing it at like 200 to 400,000, so about half the seeding rate, just to get the crop out, because it does tiller and it does do a good job. I have heard people being successful doing it that way. But, if the farmer wants to buy it and wants to use it as a cover crop, that's really their decision.
All right, thank you. Have you done research? Crimping rye has been common up here, kind of gaining some more popularity on that. Have you seen a benefit with using hybrid rye for crimping as compared to an open pollinated, for example? A rustic's been kind of the main go-to.
I unfortunately don't have an answer for that. I don't know if any research has been done on that specific topic, Ty. So I could definitely look into that. We do have a significant research going on. This year we had over 100 plots throughout the country looking at different things, seeding rates, herbicides, and things like that. I just don't think crimping was one of them.
All right, thank you. Do you have any numbers showing biomass differences with winter rye compared to open pollinated rye?
We do have a yield book on our website. The 2022 yield booklet, I think, has 2 to 3 years of data on it, and then this year's yield booklet is coming out. I don't have any of that data. I'm not sure if Carly has any in her presentation coming up. She may, but there is some very good information in the yield booklet about that. And if there is a specific, if someone needs that specific information, they can reach out to me and I can surely find that for them.